Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. And I wanted to devote this episode to a topic I think has become of much greater importance than ever before, which is the issue of rampant and virtually unlimited power vested in the hands of federal prosecutors and the way in which prosecutorial abuse has become pervasive for all sorts of improper political, careerist, and other corrupt ends. I think it has become, if not the single greatest topic, certainly one of the greatest topics of the last 5 to 6 years in US politics. And to examine this topic, I'm going to be speaking in just a minute to a guest who has a new book out. He is Rajaratnam, who has a new book, Uneven Justice, in which he first recounts the experience he had with federal prosecutors, in particular, one federal prosecutor, a very ambitious and publicity hungry Preet Bharara, who became a somewhat of a social media celebrity during the Trump years, but also rode the prosecution of, in this case, to his own level of fame, making it to the cover of Time magazine in 2012 off the back of this case. And in this book, Raj, who was a very, very successful hedge fund manager, became a billionaire through his hedge fund success, recounts not just what he regards as the injustices of the prosecution of him. That's really secondary. He doesn't have much at stake anymore in trying to prove that he was unjustly prosecuted. He served his time, 7 years in federal prison, 2 more years in house arrest, and he's now served his time. His case is free. He has nothing at stake. His book is really about the ongoing systemic abuses in the criminal justice system, and in particular, the virtually unfettered power that federal prosecutors have in prosecuting almost anybody they want for whatever they want in ways that empower them at the expense of justice. And I realize a hedge fund billionaire is not a very sympathetic figure to complain about inequities in the federal criminal justice system. He himself acknowledges that. But on the other hand, the fact that he is somebody who has confronted and endured the abuses of the system firsthand and has decided to devote his life to this cause of criminal justice reform. He's donating the proceeds of his book to groups both on the right and the left devoted to curbing prosecutorial abuse, makes his perspective particularly insightful and interesting, and I think really worth hearing. And you're going to be hearing him from him in just a minute. But I just want to underscore, because I think this might not be appreciated, how significant of an issue this has become during the Trump years and how central this issue has actually been to my work, both as a lawyer before I became a journalist, but especially once I became a journalist. The issue of prosecutorial abuse, of the fact that federal prosecutors have virtually unlimited power, is something that should concern all of us, even with rising crime rates that a lot of people are citing, the increase of violent crimes, the belief that criminals need to be prosecuted more harshly, as some people now believe. Even with that, you cannot have anybody, any human beings, with unlimited power, because they will abuse that power. That is a central tenet of my work. That is a central principle of how the American Republic was created. And yet, this book and many other episodes creates a very compelling case that that is exactly what we have, that federal prosecutors are armed with power that is simply unlimited and without any checks or accountability, and therefore, like every power that has no checks or accountability, is being systematically abused in all sorts of ways. Now, I just want to walk through the work that I've done on this issue over the years to demonstrate how central it has been to the cause of many political factions. Back in 2011, I wrote my own book called With Liberty and Justice for Some, that was designed to examine many of these same inequities in the criminal justice system and in the justice system generally. And in particular, how prosecutors have the ability to favor some people while protecting others in ways that are often very corrupt, that are designed to advance political agendas or their own careers. It is a perversion of the justice system, regardless of your ideology. And let's remember how central prosecutorial abuse was over the last 5 years. The attempt by the US security services, by the security state, by the deep state, the FBI, the CIA, to sabotage the Trump presidency and undermine it using corrupt tricks, not just with Russiagate, but also had at its core the abuse of prosecutorial power by people like Preet Bharara and Jim Comey and many others. And I just want to walk you through a few of those episodes to remind you of how significant of a role prosecutorial abuse has played in our politics and the reason why I think it deserves so much attention. So let's begin with this episode. This is from ABC News in January of 2021, reporting that a former FBI lawyer pled guilty for lying to the FISA court in order to obtain warrants to spy on Carter Page during the 2016 election. As you remember, Carter Page was a U.S. citizen. He had been affiliated with the Trump campaign and the FBI under President Obama, and then into 2017, got warrants to spy on his conversation, read his emails, listen to his telephone conversations by lying to the FISA court, by telling the FISA court untruths, by altering emails, by relying on the discredited Steele dossier, which the FBI knew at the time was discredited, and yet they cited it anyway in their warrant applications. This was an extreme abuse of prosecutorial power. And yet, this FBI lawyer who got caught lying to the FISA court in order to spy on an American citizen associated with a political campaign only got probation, which is more than they usually get. But it's an example of how pervasive law enforcement and prosecutorial abuse at the federal level became and how much of our politics it drove. Prior to that, prosecution by special counsel John Durham, that guilty plea by that FBI lawyer. In 2019, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice issued a report. Here's the headline of my article on it at The Intercept, entitled "The Inspector General's Report on 2016 FBI Spying Reveals a Scandal of Historic Magnitude," not only for the FBI, but also the U.S. media. And in there, I walk through that reporting all the different instances of abuse by the FBI and by the Justice Department as part of the FBI investigation into Russiagate. This prosecutorial abuse was rampant in the 2016 campaign for political ends. I've covered the same type of abuses that this new book discusses in the 90-minute documentary I did entitled "The Sham Prosecution of Michael Flynn." When I was still at The Intercept, the date there is May 14, 2020. It has been viewed by 250,000 people or so. And the reason it's 90 minutes long is because the prosecution of Michael Flynn contained virtually every instance, every weapon vested in the hands of prosecutors that allow them to basically turn anyone they want into a criminal. They threaten people's family members if they don't plead guilty, as they did with General Flynn, threatening to prosecute his son. They can turn people into criminals even without any evidence of an underlying crime, simply if they conclude that they lied to the FBI, which is what they ultimately convicted and prosecuted Michael Flynn for doing, and he pled guilty to it. They have built in penalties so that if you don't plead guilty and you exercise your constitutional right to go to trial, you will be punished by 2 or 3 times greater of a prison sentence than if you plead guilty. So they say to you, look, even if you're not guilty, why would you risk a trial where you may end up going to prison for 6 years or 8 years? If you plead guilty, we'll recommend that you only spend a year in prison or get probation. They use cooperating witnesses, people who are incentivized not to tell the truth, but to help the FBI convict other people. And they tell those people, if you cooperate with us, we'll recommend probation. The more you help us convict other people, the more leniency you'll get. So many incentive schemes built into the federal justice system to make people plead guilty when prosecutors want to punish them. That, consider this statistic highlighted in this new book. 97% of people charged with crimes in the federal system end up pleading guilty. They don't even bother going to trial. And the system needs that because the system is already so backlogged that if everybody were to exercise their constitutional right to a trial when charged with crimes by federal prosecutors, the whole system would collapse. So they purposely have created a system of incentives that allow the prosecutor to bully and coerce and pressure people to plead guilty, even when they're not guilty. Now, Raj, in that case, refused to plead guilty. He demanded his right to a trial, was found guilty, which is why he got such a long prison term. But so often they're able to just simply turn into criminals anybody they want. And as I detailed in this lengthy video about the Michael Flynn prosecution, almost every instance of prosecutorial abuse was present there. Now, I've also covered the instances of abuse by the FBI and the Justice Department when it comes to leaking investigations and then never trying the person or destroying their reputation simply by illegally leaking the existence of an investigation and trying to try them in the media. Just a few weeks ago, I made a video report entitled Matt Gaetz and the Dangers of Prosecutorial Leaks, in which I described how Matt Gaetz 8 months ago was basically convicted of being a pedophile, of a trafficker of children for sex because prosecutors leaked to the New York Times that he was being investigated for that. And 8 months later, he's not been charged with anything. Maybe one day he will be. Maybe one day he'll be convicted. But as of now, they succeeded in destroying his reputation by leaking to the press the existence of this investigation, but put him in the position where he can't even defend himself from the charges because there are no charges. He's never been charged. That is a major instance of prosecutorial abuse as well. So you see how much power prosecutors have in their hands to destroy people's reputation and destroy their lives with no checks and no accountability. Now, as you might know, I spent most of 2019 and 2020 engaged in a major battle with the Brazilian government over reporting that I did a 1 year long investigative expose about high level corruption on the part of Brazilian judges and prosecutors that caused a great conflict between myself and the Brazilian government to the point where the Brazilian government actually wanted to prosecute me. And what a lot of people have forgotten, including people on the left who cheered that reporting, was that the crux of that reporting was about nothing other than prosecutorial abuse, the cheating and corruption on the part of prosecutors in the name of law and order, in the name of fighting corruption. So I'll just give you one article that demonstrates that here from the Associated Press when we first did the reporting in July of 2019. The headline read, Glenn Greenwald becomes focus of Brazil press freedom debate. And the article describes exactly what our reporting revealed that caused so much tumult. Quote, several weeks after publishing explosive reports about a key member of Brazil's far right government, U.S. journalist Glenn Greenwald was called before a congressional committee to face hostile questions. Here's what the reporting was about. Greenwald's The Intercept News website last month published text messages purportedly showing then Judge and now Justice Minister Sergio Moro had improperly advised prosecutors in the corruption trial that jailed former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The article goes on. The Intercept also alleged political bias by Moro and prosecutors in a sweeping corruption investigation that brought down many of the country's business and political elite and turned Moro into a hero to many. That's what that reporting that we did for a year was about cheating on the part of prosecutors by conspiring in secret, unethically, and illegally with the judge to prosecute people for political ends. Prosecutorial abuse doesn't have an ideology. It is a grave danger to basic issues of fairness in the justice system, to the ability to have a justice system that actually functions, that punishes criminals, but does not punish innocent people or selectively prosecute people for improper ends. Another instance of prosecutorial abuse was the role of the FBI in plots like the alleged plot to kidnap Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, which we now know had the FBI at the heart of it. I interviewed Darren Beatty, the former Trump speechwriter and now journalist, in September of 2021. One of the most watched interviews I've ever done. It had almost 1.5 million views just on Rumble alone, that explored the question of whether the Justice Department and the FBI were corruptly inducing and enticing people into committing crimes by having informants encourage and urge them and entrap them to do so, not just with the Michigan case, but also in the case of January 6th. Now, the context to Raj's prosecution was the fact that in 2008, there was a major financial crisis on Wall Street. And when President Obama, weeks later, assumed office, they basically decided they were going to prosecute none of the people responsible for that financial crisis. And they didn't. The Obama Justice Department under Eric Holder did not prosecute a single person responsible on Wall Street for the 2008 financial crisis. Here's an article I wrote in The Guardian in January of 2013, the headline of which was The Untouchables, How the Obama Administration Protected Wall Street from Prosecutions. And it talks about a new PBS Frontline report that details how the Obama administration repeatedly chose to prosecute none of the Wall Street tycoons responsible for the debacle with Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers or the financial crisis that caused the suffering of hundreds of millions of people in multiple countries for many years. Here's an article in USA Today from August of 2015 that puts it very simply in the headline: Obama legacy includes banker impunity. And it describes there how Obama made the decision. The Obama Justice Department under Eric Holder chose not to prosecute any Wall Street tycoons. Now, the reason I remember Raj's prosecution is because whenever this argument was made, the Obama administration chose not to prosecute any of the people responsible for the 2008 Wall Street financial crisis right after Obama had received overwhelmingly the overwhelming share of Wall Street largesse in the 2008 election when he ran against John McCain. Wall Street supported Obama overwhelmingly in that campaign. They would point to Preet Bharara's prosecution of Raj for insider trading to say, oh, look, we're prosecuting Wall Street billionaires. That was the case that they essentially constantly pointed to as proof that they were willing to prosecute Wall Street. And in fact, it led to this amazing Time magazine cover featuring Preet Bharara, who at the time was the main prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, with the title, This Man is Busting Wall Street. This man is busting Wall Street. The same administration, the same set of prosecutors who purposely refrained from going after the real criminals that caused the 2008 financial crisis somehow ended up on the cover of Time magazine with this hagiography, with this propagandistic praise for staring down and busting Wall Street corruption. And it was all based on this single prosecution or a series of prosecutions that were much smaller in scope and easier to prosecute, but that had nothing to do with the 2008 financial crisis. Now, let me just show you before introducing Raj and my interview with him about his experience, this article from the New York Times in 2014, the headline of which is Why Only One Top Banker Went to Jail for the Financial Crisis. And that top banker was Raj, who you're about to hear from. But the real point of the article was that Preet Bharara had the opportunity to prosecute the real people responsible for the mortgage crisis, for the derivative schemes that caused the financial crisis. But he chose not to do so because those were hard prosecutions, and he wanted his career to be built on the back of successful prosecutions and didn't want to risk an imperfect record. And so let the real criminals go and went after these small cases. This is the kind of discretion prosecutors have to advance their own careerist interests at the expense of justice. Look what this article says. It's from the New York Times, and it's talking about how these prosecutors in New York, in the Southern District of New York, under Preet Bharara, had the opportunity to prosecute the real Wall Street criminals. It says, quote, given that Washington rejected a unified national task force, these career motivations would prove particularly relevant. Career motivations meaning prosecutors are incentivized only to pursue cases they know they can win. When Preet Bharara, former chief counsel for Senator Chuck Schumer, arrived in the Southern District of New York in 2009, he had a decision to make. There were cases arising from the financial crisis, which would take years to investigate, and after all that, never make it to a jury. Or there were insider trading cases, which were far more straightforward. Someone improperly learns non-public details about a company and makes a killing on the stock market. Quote, you do have a tough choice, one former Southern District prosecutor says, quote, and I'm going to chase after crimes I don't know were committed and don't know who by, or do we go after crimes we do know who were committed and by whom? That was the justification for not pursuing the people who caused one of the worst financial crises in the history of the United States. The article goes on. Bharara chose to focus on insider trading, and his office has amassed a stunning $80 to zero record of prosecutions, locking up the hedge fund titan Rajaratnam and Rajat Gupta, the former managing director of McKinsey and Company, and a director at Goldman Sachs. They took down 8 former employees of Stephen A. Cohen's notorious SAC Capital hedge fund. Notably, however, they haven't been able to bring charges against the man himself. Time magazine put Bharara on the cover with the bold headline, "The man is busting Wall Street." Yet, Bharara didn't touch Wall Street's real players, the top bankers. The former prosecutor was almost sheepish about the insider trading cases when I spoke to him. Quote, "They made our careers, but they don't change the world." That was Preet Bharara admitting that while the cases he chose to pursue, the easy ones, made his career, they didn't really do anything to affect the world because they were so tiny in the scope of the Wall Street fraud. He purposely chose not to pursue. The article goes on. In fact, several former prosecutors in the office told me that going after bankers was never a real priority. Quote, "The government failed," another former prosecutor said. Quote, "We didn't do what we needed to do." As a result, Bharara and his team neglected seemingly winnable cases in their own backyard, including one particularly big one. After Lehman Brothers imploded, the Justice Department's Washington headquarters split responsibility investigating what the bank's executives knew among 3 U.S. attorneys' office, including Bharara, but he chose not to prosecute any of those cases. And as a result, the executives from Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, the people who caused the crisis, all went free, and he decided instead, using various dubious techniques, whether you believe he's guilty or not, to prosecute Rajaratnam, who spent 7 years in prison, 2 years under house arrest, and now has a book called Uneven Justice. He argues in this book, and as you'll hear from him in the interview that you're about to hear, he believes he was unjustly prosecuted. But he also says, you don't believe that, even if you don't believe that, the more important point from this book is that while some people are now more law and order than ever because of the need to punish violent criminals, we need to be acutely aware of how dangerous it is that these federal prosecutors are armed with so many weapons, ambiguous federal crimes, 5,000 federal crimes that mean people on average commit multiple federal crimes a week without even knowing they're doing so, the ability to threaten your family members if you don't plead guilty, the penalty that comes from failing to plead guilty and demanding a trial that almost every rational person would decide to plead guilty, even if they're not, just to avoid that penalty, the financial impossibility of taking on the federal government that has unlimited resources, so many different weapons that have been vested in the hands of federal prosecutors, so many different structures that have been imposed on the federal judiciary that make federal prosecutors basically like monarchs who can pick and choose when to prosecute and almost can never be defeated because the system is so tilted in their favor. Again, I don't think it matters what your ideology is, if you're on the left or the right. Everyone has seen prosecutorial abuse wreak damage on lives and families, and especially, most importantly, our political system and our system of justice. So I highly recommend this book, not for the arguments he makes about his own case, but for the window that his own case provided him into understanding these systemic abuses and the reason all of us should care so much about them. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Sure. So as I've indicated, as soon as I read the book, and then again in the monologue that I just did, I regard your new book, and the cover is up there on the screen where people can see it, Uneven Justice, to be a really critical examination of the inherent inequities in the criminal justice system, especially on the federal level, especially when it comes to criminal prosecutors. And before we get into the substance of the book and the experience that you endured in order to be able to have insights into this process, I want to ask you about what I'm certain is going to be the reaction of skeptics. I actually have heard I heard this as soon as I talked about the book the first time. I'm sure you've heard it as well, which is, even among people who may be sympathetic to the idea that there are serious flaws in the criminal justice system, the attitude is, well, look, Raj is somebody who went through his whole life, not really caring about this cause particularly much. He made a lot of money on Wall Street and as a hedge fund manager, and now suddenly, because he himself was ensnared in the criminal justice system, he's writing a book about its flaws as a way of vindicating himself or arguing that he was treated unfairly, and so I don't regard him as a particularly good messenger for these points. What do you say to people who have that kind of jaded view of the book?
Glenn, as you know, only about 2 or 3% of the people go to trial. So my resume includes being arrested, going to trial, not plea bargaining, not trying to be a cooperating witness, went to trial, lost, got sentenced, went to prison. So I've seen the whole spectrum of how the Justice Department worked in my case. Now, I have to admit that prior to being arrested, I thought the FBI did a great job. Only bad people went to prison, and the prosecutors did a good job. I don't know anybody who's been arrested or indicted. I don't know anybody who knew anybody who went to jail. So this was to me just a new experience. So, yes, I didn't worry about it till it happened to me. And when I went to prison, my story was not unique. There were several stories of prosecutorial overreach. Now, I could keep quiet and move on about my life, but it was so outrageous that I thought I should speak about it. I'm not trying to relitigate my case. I maintain I was innocent, but the whole point of the book was to open people's eyes and show that when you have absolute power, like the prosecutors have, sometimes they abuse that power absolutely. Not the entire system, but some slivers of the US prosecutor's office and law enforcement.
Yeah, the thing that convinced me about the authenticity of the book, I had that same thought when I began to read it was, is this just an attempt by someone who was convicted, feels he was wrongfully convicted, and is sort of trying to plead his own case, and the fact that you don't actually have a lot at stake. Your case is essentially concluded. You've served your time in prison. Made me believe, as you said, that you could move on, but you obviously feel there's something systemically wrong with the system, and sometimes it does take, I think, a personal interaction with an injustice to really understand the full scope of it. Before we get into the specifics of these systemic flaws, I want to ask you about the prosecutor in your case, Preet Bharara, who over the last 5 years or so has become, I think, even more known than he was previously, and known in particular as somebody who seems to really crave a lot of public celebrity and public attention. He was one of those people who gained a kind of social media celebrity by being very outspoken about Donald Trump and about Russiagate and sort of the standard critiques of the Trump administration. And, one of the things I found so interesting was he kind of rode your case to a fame that a lot of people before who weren't paying such close attention until Donald Trump don't really know about. He actually wrote it to the cover of Time magazine in 2012, and you can see it on the screen where Time magazine heralded him as quote the man. This man is busting Wall Street. And one of the ironies is that the critique of the Obama Justice Department and of the Southern District of New York that he headed was that, in fact, very few, if any, of the people responsible for the 2008 financial crisis were actually prosecuted. They didn't prosecute the people responsible for Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns or the financial collapse. Instead, they constantly held up your case as the proof that they were being hard on Wall Street. Can you talk about the role specifically of this particular prosecutor, and now that we kinda have the benefit of hindsight about what motivates him, about his quest for fame and his ambition, what those insights can tell us about how your case was chosen to be prosecuted.
So let me first make a quote that he gave, I think, New York Times reporter, which is the only office that I crave for, I can't get. Um, People say that's the presidency of the United States because he was not born in the US. So you can surmise that his ambitions are very large. Now, as you correctly pointed out, the 2008 crisis was precipitated by the mortgage business. where American household lost $7 trillion in wealth. And this was because the big banks were selling mortgages that the buyers didn't understand. Mr. Barara ignored going after any of the big banks. He chose a small sliver of the hedge fund business, the long short equity fund, which is what I was doing, which had nothing to do with the mortgage crisis. And he wrote that. 3 years after my conviction, they charged a co conspirator of mine with the same charges, in the same stocks, with the same cooperating witnesses, and the jury found the defendant in that case innocent. And Mr. Barara went on a rant about the judge, calling him the worst judge he's ever seen. So he's a sore loser. Now, fast forward to 2020, he has this task force with the same judges and some of the prosecutors trying to define insider trading. And the conclusion of the Barara task force, appropriately named the Barara task force, is that insider trading laws are murky and it's incredibly confusing to the market participants. So, in my opinion, Mr. Barara used murky laws to indict 80 people that had nothing to do with the financial crisis. And he was so um, enjoying the limelight that several years later he sobered up and realized that these laws are murky. He also said something which is insider trading laws did nothing but to change the world, but to enhance our careers. So therein lies some insights into the man. Having said that,
You know, oh, go ahead. Good.
just one more sentence. Having said that,
Yeah, no, go ahead.
he doesn't occupy any piece of my mind right now. I don't have space for him in my mind because I've moved on.
Yeah, so and I know that, that's again, if your book had been primarily about your own case, I'm not sure I would be somebody who would be saying this is a really important book to read. It's precisely because you moved on and are looking at the systemic flaws in the justice system that makes me think this book is so worthy of attention. Nonetheless, your case is kind of a window into some of these injustices. Obviously, it's the thing that enabled you to start thinking about it. And just focusing on this particular prosecutor for one more second, there was an article in the New York Times from 2014 by a really great financial investigative journalist who's now at ProPublica, titled "Why Only One Top Banker Went to Jail for the Financial Crisis." And I talked about this article in my monologue, so I won't go through it again. But in essence, it describes how Preet Bharara had the opportunity to prosecute the actual parties responsible for the bulk of the 2008 financial crisis, but because that was going to be a harder case, a more complex case with a lot more at stake, he was afraid of losing and having that mar his prosecutorial record, that he instead went after a much smaller case. And it's kind of odd, I think, for people intuitively to think about you as being a smaller case given your, great financial wealth that you amassed and your success as a hedge fund manager, but talk nonetheless about what this case that he chose to bring against you represented in terms of, first, your overall trading and your overall business, but then also in the scheme of what happened that caused the 2008 financial crisis, just to put into perspective what he chose to spend his time on and what he chose not to.
Yeah, so you're right. It's easier to go after a small industry. And after looking at 4 million documents and every one of my trades for 5 years, they concluded that 0.01% of my trades were potentially based on insider information. That means 99.9% of my trades were legitimate by their standings. Right? The two people that they used to get the indictment, as you know, in the United States, the indictment is when you go to the grand jury is ex parte, which means only the prosecutor gets to speak, the defendant doesn't. Were found unsuitable to testify in my case. In many cases, they would have dropped the case, but because he put all the public glare on my case, he couldn't back down. So now they try to make me a cooperating witness and try to get me to ensnare bigger hedge fund managers. I was not brought up that way. If I did something wrong, I would take the punishment. But I'm not going to point fingers at somebody else just to get a better deal. This is a unique part of the American system where people, when they get indicted, have three choices: plead guilty to a lesser offense, and point fingers at somebody else, or go to trial. Very few people go to trial. So, what Mr. Bharara did, in my opinion, is he should have not gone further with the case. They interviewed 25 analysts at Galleon and asked them, did you see anything that was improper? And all of them said no. And according to their admission to the judge, their case came to a standstill. But they were so adamant in going after me that they then used wiretaps. The wiretap application, the judge ruled that the FBI lied. It had a reckless disregard for the truth. Yet the judge allowed the wiretap to go through. So there's a series of prosecutorial overreaches in my case, coaching cooperating witnesses who then recanted, and so on and so forth. The prosecutor in the summation to jury misleading the court and the jury. Because remember, if you're politically ambitious, you can't lose high profile cases. So when they talk about greed on Wall Street, what they don't talk about is the greed for power in law enforcement.
Let me dig a little bit into this statistic because it is a remarkable statistic, which is that 97% of the people who are charged with crimes in the federal system end up pleading guilty. And in some sense, the system actually requires that. It depends on that, right? It can't really withstand everybody going to trial, which is supposed to be your constitutional right, because the system is already so overcrowded, even with everybody pleading guilty, that if everybody were to insist on the right to a jury trial, essentially the entire system would collapse. So, one of the arguments that you make in your book, and one of the long standing arguments of criminal justice reform advocates, both on the libertarian right and on the left, this isn't something that you invented, is that the system is essentially designed to make it almost impossible for any rational person to plead not guilty and to go to trial. That almost every rational person, whether they're guilty or not, will end up pleading guilty anyway. Talk about what it is about the system that makes that the case.
Well, number one, just the prohibitive cost of going to trial, which many people find it onerous. Number two, what they did in my case is they charged me with eight stocks. And then when I
But hold on. Before you go into number two, let's just stick on number one for a second. So the prohibitive cost, by which you mean the financial
financial
cost.
costs,
In your case, right. So in your case, that wouldn't necessarily be a deterrent, although for the almost everybody who is something short of a billionaire, it would be. The government has unlimited funds. But typically the argument when you say that is, Well, even if you can't afford a lawyer in the federal system, you get a public defender. The public defender, unlike in the state system, is actually quite competent. They're not as overloaded. Is that argument true? Do you get a competent, zealous defense, even if you can't afford to defend against the government if you rely on the public defenders?
The public defenders also encourage you to plead because there's something called a trial penalty. Studies have shown that if you go to trial and lose, you get twice the penalty as if you pled guilty. So they throw another incentive on you. If you plead guilty and don't go to trial, we will recommend 2 years rather than the 5 or 7 years that you face. So, in addition to the financial burden, you have the trial penalty. Then, if that doesn't deter you, they go after your family, threaten to indict your family. So there's a whole playbook that prosecutors have. Now, why do they do this? Because they can get away with it. And there's no accountability for prosecutors in our system.
So in your case, you ended up serving 7 years in prison, more or less. You are currently still under house arrest. What? Oh, you're not under house.
No, I'm not. I'm
Okay, you're done with
yeah,
house arrest.
I'm done with house arrest,
Well, how much time did you
and
have in
I'm
house
moving
arrest after your sentence? Right. Right. Okay.
about two
So
years.
that's a lot
About
of
two
time. That's
years.
a lot of years. Was there ever a point in your case prior to trial when they tried to offer you some kind of lesser sentence, or did you make clear from the beginning that you weren't open to pleading guilty?
No, they repeatedly wanted us to come and talk, and even after I was sentenced, they wanted me to cooperate with against another high-profile gentleman, uh, the former head of McKinsey, Mr. Rajat Gupta, and I refused because I was not going to lie uh, to indict or help imprison another person.
So, I this is one of the things I find so interesting is so you have this already immense incentive to plead guilty, whether you're guilty or not, which is they say if you plead guilty, we'll recommend a short prison sentence, 2 years, 2.5 years. But if you roll the dice on the same exact crime and you're found guilty, the judge is almost certainly going to sentence you to double, sometimes even triple the punishment. So as you say, it's literally a penalty for exercising your constitutional right to a trial. That's a huge incentive to plead guilty, even if you're not. But the other one of the other incentives that you talk about a lot in your book, and I'd like you to elaborate on, is the use of cooperating witnesses because there too the incentive scheme is so intrinsically corrupt. So what is the incentive scheme if you had decided that you wanted to be a cooperating witness, if you had accepted the government's offer to testify against Mr. Gupta or other people, what would have been your incentive scheme? Would it just have been to tell the truth, or would you have had incentives to help the prosecution convict other people?
So in the Southern District, they sign a cooperating witness with the cooperating witness, a cooperating agreement, I mean, and it's explicitly states that they will help write a letter to the judge based on the extent of the cooperation. So, what does that do? That incentivizes the cooperating witness to help the prosecution make their case. In my case, the chief witness, the star witness of the government, essentially told the court that he gave me information. In a similar case, 3 years from then, he recanted his testimony and said, I called Raj to see what he was thinking and I gave him no useful information. And so, in that case, the defendant got found not guilty. Now, you might ask me, why did he change his mind? Because he had been sentenced. He did his 2 years probation and he was no longer under the leash of the government. So that demonstrates to you, when they're under the leash of the government, they will say whatever they want to get a shorter sentence, in this case, parole. And then, I guess it disturbed him that he came clean in the case 3 years later. This witness, Anil Kumar, after the second case, called my wife in tears and said, "I apologize. I sent an innocent man to prison." So you can say that he made a rational decision to cooperate and he got parole, or you can say that he was a man of no integrity and did something that he would regret. Now I'm going to tell you,
Yeah, and yeah, I think it's very hard to judge somebody until you're in that position, right? I mean, you were in that position and you made one choice, which was to stand on your principles and refuse to cooperate against what you thought was an unjust prosecution, even if it meant that you were going to be in prison for longer. Obviously, other people, prison is a genuine threat. It's frightening. It's terrifying for people. It makes people do things to avoid it, including falsely testifying. I think the thing that a lot of people have trouble understanding is that these incentives are so obvious to be corrupt, right? It'd be one thing if you tell, if you, it'd be one thing if you have a cooperating witness system where you tell the person, if you tell the truth, then you'll end up with a lesser sentence as a result of having cooperated with law enforcement. But when you specifically have them know that they're going to get rewards for helping the government convict people, which is essentially what their incentive scheme is, then you're really encouraging them to do anything, regardless of the truth, to help obtain convictions. Why do you think we've gotten to the point where there are so many of these different built in corrupting incentives that are in the system? Is it just that there's no political force in favor of criminal justice reform? Is it that the system itself needs this kind of incentive? What do you think explains why so many corrupting motives have been stacked one on top of the next for so
Glenn,
long?
in my opinion, no democracy as we know it is as politicized in the judicial system as the United States. Let me explain. Prosecutors are appointed by the president. So there are 92 or so prosecutors. When the new president comes, they all resign, and the new president reappoints people that he considers part of his agenda. Preet Bharara was one of the few who didn't resign and was fired by Trump. And he used that as a big media event to catapult himself into a job as a CNN commentator, now taking on Trump. Right. So, number one, the system is politicized at the federal level. Now, at the state and country level, judges stand for election. In other countries, part of the British Commonwealth or other Western democracies, judges are career judges, prosecutors are career officials that don't espouse any party or bipartisan tendencies. So it's politicized. Now, if you're ambitious, nobody wants a prosecutor who loses. So many prosecutors are willing to bend the rules, including coaching the witnesses to win. They're not looking for the truth and the justice, they're looking for a win. Now, the fastest way to become a partner in a law firm is if you're a prosecutor. The fastest way to become a judge is if you're an ex prosecutor. If you look at the law, the people in Congress and the Senate who have a legal background, many of them were ex prosecutors,
Including the vice
including the
president.
vice president. And, Mr. Biden is one of the few who was not a prosecutor, but many of them had their background in prosecution. Now, I would submit to you, and I've studied this very carefully, Martha Stewart did not trade on inside information. She may have committed perjury, but that was a high profile case, and the prosecutor for the Southern District, Comey, ended up becoming, immediately after the case, an assistant attorney general for the United States, and then, as you know, FBI director, and so on and so forth. So the path is clear. There's a political ladder on which they climb, and there's no accountability. They recently found the only time there was accountability was an ex prosecutor spent 5 days in jail in Texas because they found that he had hid evidence and sent somebody to jail for 25 years for a murder that the guy didn't commit, and he got 5 days. Right? We talk about criminal justice reform, we talk about prosecutorial accountability, we talk about politicized. What nobody talks about is the hundreds and thousands of lives, the emotional toll on the family, on the defendant, on society, that this unchecked power creates. I've been there, I know the pain that you have to go through. Now, let me tell you how I dealt with it. When I when I started feeling sorry for myself, I used to think about the young men in Iraq and Afghanistan living in 100-degree temperatures, eating out of a can, putting themselves in harm's way. And I immediately got strength to fight, keep on fighting.
One of the reactions that I think people have to this argument, and one of the obstacles I think needs to be overcome in order to advance this agenda of reforming the justice system, is especially now when people see rising crime rates and prosecutors who have been elected based on a promise of using prison sentences less. They cite the fact that the United States is the country that has jailed more than any other, that jails more than any other of its population in the world, which is true both on an absolute basis. We have more prisoners in the United States than even countries with much, much greater populations, such as China and India. And also on a proportional basis, we imprison a greater percentage of our citizens than any other. The percentage, I don't know if it's still true, but for years it was true that the United States is 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the prison population is in the United States. I think it's a little bit less now, but not much. The argument is that there's been all this reform based on those stats to imprison people for less time, to let people go on probation or parole rather than to prison. And as a result, there are these now skyrocketing crime statistics, murder, violent crime in American cities. And a lot of people are going to listen to this argument and think this is the worst possible time to try and tie the hands of prosecutors, because if anything, we need to strengthen prosecutors' power because we're not putting enough people in prison, which is why we have such high crime rates. What do you say to that objection to this agenda of criminal justice reform? Why should people be concerned about excessive prosecutorial power at a time when, to many people, it seems as though not enough criminals are being put into prison?
Yeah. So I think you're right. There's bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. So far, bulk of the discussion has been on police brutality on the streets. And the reason is because we can see, because of the prevalence of cameras and iPhones, we can see it visually in our bedrooms or in our living rooms. What we can't see is the damage being done in the courtroom. Right? Now, I am not saying that we should not punish crime at all. I'm just saying that the prosecutors should play by the rules and honor the court like the founding fathers wanted, and that they should be reprimanded if they don't search for justice, but they look to win at all costs. Uh, any civic society has to have laws and law enforcement, and I'm for that 100% of the time. What I'm saying is play by the same rules that the defense plays. Give the citizen the right to defend himself, and let's search for the truth together and not just win because that enhances your career. And that's what I'm saying. So it's a subtle difference from let's not be tough on crime. I think violent criminals should go to jail. If you're a threat to society, you should go to jail, but play by the rules. This is America. I love this country. I came to this country voluntarily, and I accept the verdict of the jury, even though I don't agree with it. But I feel it incumbent upon myself to speak out. And
I want to talk. Oh,
one
go
last
ahead. Sorry,
point,
go ahead. Go ahead and finish that.
every
Yeah, go
dollar
ahead.
from this book goes to charity to cause a discussion about prosecutorial accountability.
And I want to talk about that, the politics of this cause. It's interesting. Before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer for 10 years. I did almost entirely civil litigation, not criminal. But I nonetheless, one of the main reasons why I became disenchanted was because of the unfairness of the criminal of the justice system itself, of the politicization of the judges, the way in which they were selected favored corporate law firms over individuals and the like, a lot of the same inequities and frustrations that you've described. And then when I was a journalist, I wrote a book in 2011 called With Liberty and Justice for Some, where I described a lot of the inherent inequities in both the civil and criminal justice system. And at the time, the politics of criminal justice reform was such that there was a lot of support, as I alluded to earlier, on kind of the libertarian right. There's always been among libertarians, the Cato Institute, the Koch brothers have financed a lot of criminal justice reform with the ACLU, with the Cato Institute. Ron Paul and Rand Paul have talked about the inequities of the drug war. And also on the left, there's always been a sense that prosecutors have too much power, but there's a lot of hostility toward that on the right, on kind of the mainstream conservatism. And one of the really interesting things that I've seen over the last 5 years is that that has really changed in part because somewhat has happened to you. It's not that the American conservatives themselves are unfairly prosecuted, but they saw how prosecutorial power, when it's out of control and unchecked, like any power, can be corrupted. You mentioned earlier James Comey, who prosecuted Martha Stewart. We talked already about Preet Bharara and the role he played in your case. I think, people saw runaway prosecutors in the Michael Flynn case, where so many of the elements that you've described in your book and that happened to you, threatening family members. I mean, the reason Michael Flynn pled guilty was because they threatened to prosecute his son and put his son in prison, which is a huge power in order to get people to plead guilty. The ability to kind of criminalize almost anything, which I want to talk to you about in a little bit. So I think the combination of watching prosecutors like Preet Bharara and Jim Comey and just the Justice Department in general, with Russiagate prosecutions and the like, kind of go out of control, has created more receptivity on the American right than ever before to criminal justice reform. As someone who is now devoted to this cause, donating your book's profits to this cause, financing groups who are devoted to this kind of reform, what do you think are the political challenges in order to overcome, in order to get this cause uh, generate more support for it, especially in light of some of the pressures that we now see with crime growing?
Well, one is a personal issue, which is, as you pointed out, here's a rich guy, right? Uh, you know, people don't have much sympathy for wealthy individuals. But that's a personal issue that I have to overcome. Um, the bigger issue is to appeal to the fairness of the American people, whether it's on the left or the right. Right? Recently, we've seen the fake news and the previous government exposed how the FBI operates, how the Department operates, and it's now an issue that's being discussed. And hopefully, my book and my talking to people like you can move the discussion a tiny step forward. Um, I think Americans, at the end of the day, are fair people. They're good people. And if we continue to talk about it, change will happen. And there's precedence for how things started with a small step and then it gathers momentum. For me, this is an important issue. And I didn't need the publicity, but I wanted to speak up. I didn't want just regard this just as a nightmare and I'll move on with my life, um, which is pretty comfortable. So I think there will be lots of obstacles, but if we keep talking about it, then maybe the prosecution will think about it. What's alarming to me is, at least in the Southern District, I've spoken to other prosecutors who were serving at the same time as Mr. Barara. Many of them admit that he bent some rules, but they've never called him out. They never called him out. So it's a culture that needs to be changed. And I think by us talking about it, hopefully we can change. You've seen what's happened in the women's rights movements. You've seen what's happened in the LGBT movement. You've seen what happens in several other movements. There's resistance, and then if you're speaking the truth, hopefully there'll be a groundswell of support. And also today, we have social media, which is a great way to reach people.
Yeah, I wanted there's one kind of last weapon that prosecutors have that you talk about in your book that I think is incredibly important that people don't realize, which is the fact that it's extremely easy to criminalize people's behavior. There's so many you talked earlier, for example, about insider trading laws being very, very ambiguous. When does information that you receive turn into insider information? And in that ambiguity, whenever laws are ambiguous, prosecutors have enormous power to basically turn anyone they want into a criminal. Another way they can do that, though, is that so many things that people don't realize are crimes or people think shouldn't be crimes actually are federal crimes. I was reading earlier today. I just actually by accident ran into this as I was thinking about our interview. Um, that under the law, and the FBI has made this explicitly clear, if you're somebody who sells illegal drugs, you've obviously committed a crime. Usually it's a state crime. You sell cocaine, you sell marijuana in states where it's illegal, you sell prescription drugs, it becomes a state crime. Usually there's not a lot of penalties involved. But one of the things the federal government has done is said, if you sell illegal drugs or if you steal some object, any object, you're required to report that income that you get from selling illegal drugs or the property that you've stolen to the IRS as income. And if you fail to report that income to the IRS, it then becomes a federal crime. So now the federal government has the ability to take what is often a minor state crime, selling illegal drugs in small quantities, stealing some item of small value, and now suddenly becomes a federal crime because you failed to report that income on your federal tax returns. Obviously, no one's going to report that income on their federal tax returns. They can turn anyone into a criminal. You mentioned the Martha Stewart case. Also, the same thing happened in the Michael Flynn case, where basically they were convicted of nothing more than just lying to investigators without even there being an underlying crime proven. And people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg has written opinions saying that it's really a gross breach of constitutional rights to allow prosecutors to turn you into a criminal simply because you lie to the FBI without an underlying crime being proven. Um, There's been people convicted of lying to Congress and testimony, um, all kinds of things. I think there's over 5,000 different federal crimes. It's very easy to turn people into federal criminals. Talk a little bit about the power that that puts into the hands of federal prosecutors, both the ambiguity of certain laws as well as the multiplicity of laws that allow them to criminalize almost anything.
So, former KGB chief said, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." The federal laws, criminal laws, as you said, there are 5,000 laws. And there's a brilliant book by Harvey Silverglate that said every American commits 3 felonies a day without knowing it. Right? Now, when I first went to prison, I met this gentleman who was sent to prison because he had $200,000 in a Swiss bank account. Okay, UBS and Credit Suisse had helped hundreds of thousands of Americans hide billions of dollars. What did they get? A slap on the wrist and a fine. Because the prosecution went after this gentleman who was a venture capitalist and a reasonably high profile guy and was scared to take on UBS or Credit Suisse was done. So these 5,000 laws, criminal laws, give them enormous power. And then when they don't have checks and balances, you can run amok. And one other thing that I want to point that we haven't talked about in my case is that the FBI lied on their wiretap affidavit to get a wiretap on me. The judge recognized it. This is called Title III, as you know, as a lawyer, right? If the judge allows the FBI to lie, recognizes that the FBI lied, and allows the wiretaps to be played in court or allows it, think about what can happen to any American. What is the message you're sending the FBI? Every American should be concerned about it. And the person who wrote the wiretap statute, Professor Blake, wrote an amicus brief on my behalf saying this wiretap should be suppressed. So we need urgent reform today. We need to understand that there is a dark state which acts with impunity. And you've mentioned a few people, Michael Flynn, and there are so many others that are languishing in jail because of some guy or some woman bending the rules for their personal benefit. And that's sort of the central message of my book.
Yeah, I think the key to your book is, and you alluded to this earlier, and I want to kind of conclude on this note because for me it's the crux is the idea of prosecutorial accountability. People remember, for example, during the Russiagate investigation, which really dominated our politics for 40 years. So I think it's a really great window into how prosecutorial power was abused, can be abused for political ends and career ends. That during the 2016 campaign, the FBI obtained the court authorization to spy on somebody who had been affiliated with the Trump campaign, Carter Page, an American citizen. It wasn't through Title III, it was through FISA, which is a separate process when you believe someone might be an agent of a foreign power. And as it turns out, the inspector general of the Justice Department said that the FBI lied repeatedly to the FISA court in order to obtain these warrants. They relied on the Steele dossier, which people now know is not only debunked, but the FBI knew very early on was an unreliable document, a completely unreliable document, that the sourcing for it was almost non-existent, and yet they relied on it in part to get the Steele dossier. And there was one FBI lawyer who pled guilty to submitting false information to the FISA court in order to obtain spying authorization from the FISA court, an incredibly grave crime, and yet they barely got punished at all. And you see this often. They have the ability as well to decide who gets punished. If you wield a lot of power in Washington, like David Petraeus, you might get a slap on the wrist. If there's somebody that they're at, if you're somebody they're after for whatever reasons, you can go to prison for a long time, as you did in your case, as they tried to do to a lot of people affiliated with Donald Trump. Huge amounts of discretion in the hands of prosecutors. One of the foundations of my work as a lawyer, but especially as a journalist, is that any kind of power in the hands of authorities will be abused if there aren't checks and balances and limitations on how that power is exercised. And one of the most important ways that we try and check power is that if the power is abused, there's transparency surrounding it, and then there's punishment for it. And yet, as you point out, I think most compellingly in your book, prosecutorial accountability is almost non-existent. Even if, you get caught as a prosecutor hiding exculpatory information that you have the legal duty to disclose, and you convict somebody because of it, they go to prison for many years, and only afterwards is it discovered that you cheated to put someone in prison for years. You one time a prosecutor got a small slap on the wrist and nothing else. What is it that people need to understand about this issue of prosecutorial accountability, and what are the reforms specifically you think are needed to correct this huge incentive for corruption within prosecutorial power?
So you talk about uneven justice, which happens to be the name of my book. I think number one, prosecutors should be punished for breaking the law, criminally punished. And unless that happens, they have no incentive to abide by the laws. I think the judges should take a much more active role in this. I think the compatriots of these prosecutors should call them out when they see other prosecutors bending the rules. I think that you should not try a person in the media prior to conviction. Once a person is convicted, you can talk as much as you want about the media because now he's a convicted felon to deter other people. But to try somebody in the media like Michael Flynn or Russiagate, or in my case, is grossly prejudicial to the defendant. Remember, public opinion is a huge factor for those politically ambitious prosecutors. So, in my case, like they did with Flynn and several others, they vilify the defendant, try to get public opinion on their side, and it's a shame that they're allowed to get away with it. So, please join me in talking about these issues and see whether we can make a change.
Well, Raj, look, I mean, this has been a cause of mine for a long time. I think it's been a cause for a lot of people's. I think the prominence of prosecutorial abuse has increased significantly over the last 5 years, and different political factions that used to be somewhat closed minded or not very receptive to this cause have become much more receptive to it, seeing firsthand how much abuse there can be in the hands of prosecutors. So I think your book is an incredibly important advancement in bringing attention to this cause. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing on it and taking the time to talk to me about it as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Glenn. And remember, you can't break a man who refuses to be broken.